I hope you had a wonderful morning, 2 sessions. We are now down to our last session in this International Conference for Research on African Challenges, ICRAC 1, 2019. And the purpose of this session is similar to the one we had by the end of yesterday's parallel sessions, which is to try to look into opportunities for integration between the different disciplines who have been presenting today. So today we had 4 parallel tracks, and I'm going to call the invited co-chairs of the parallel tracks to the panel, to the podium, to provide us with the takeaways of the papers presented in their respective panels or in their respective sessions. In a first round, it will be 5 minutes for each of the chairs. And then there will be another round, which is 5 minutes looking into opportunities of integration and synergy by the session chairs. And then we'll open for the floor to provide their thoughts, reflections, ideas, concepts, proposals, projects, potentials. So we'll give 2 minutes to each of the floor members who would like to participate. So can I ask to the panel, please, Professor Farhad and Professor Zuga, Professor Amber, and Professor Hania. So thank you very much for coming to participate with the takeaways of your the paper presented or papers presented in your sessions. This is not an assessment of the papers themselves or their quality. This is basically what came out that could potentially be useful for looking into future integrations and future multidisciplinary work and so on. So the takeaways are going to guide us for a discussion around this direction. So can we start with Professor Zuga?
Just give me a minute and I will find my notes that summarizes what we did.
You will have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
Yes.
No, I found them. Thank you very much. We had 4 presentations that one was from Rwanda on non-performing loans. The other one was from Zimbabwe, looking at the informal sector and the mindsets of governments. The third was from Cameroon on capital flight. And the last one was from Egypt, looking at CRM in the context of corporate social responsibility. So all these papers, from a multidisciplinary perspective, are kind of diverse in the sense that we had papers that were from a financial perspective, entrepreneurial perspective, and marketing or sales perspective. And essentially, they were all trying to gauge at how poverty can be solved. I think if I want to reflect on how those papers can be integrated with other disciplines, at least within the business field, I can say entrepreneurship, finance, and marketing are functional areas that could come together to look at poverty. And in terms of understanding what poverty is, overwhelmingly, it looks to me that the studies focused on what I would call the physiological aspect, in other words, looking at the economics and how the wants or needs of people are met. But I think there was one paper that hinted at another type of poverty that is often sometimes not considered, and that is psychological, or what is in the minds, what the authors call the mindset of people. So in reflecting on the papers and how they can contribute to advance understanding of management from a multidisciplinary perspective, the economic studies that focus on economic type of poverty, as well as this other paper that focus on what I would call the psychological poverty, kind of got me to reflect on other types of poverty that would help in coming up with a holistic understanding of what we mean by poverty and the solutions to resolving poverty. I think it's more than just consideration of the economic aspect of poverty. The psychological as well as the technological and philosophical or epistemological types of poverty would need to be considered, and to the extent that they can be integrated with other disciplines, they would help in our understanding of what poverty is and the solutions that would emerge as a result of that discussion. And that is what I would say for our group. Thank you.
Amber, can you give us a flavor of the takeaways of the sessions that you shared today?
Absolutely. Yeah, good afternoon. And I also wanted to take the time to thank AUC and the organizers of the conference for putting this together and creating the space to have these conversations. It was a pleasure to co-chair the final track, which was on gendering agency. And we had 4 interdisciplinary excellent papers that I suppose grappled with fundamental issues of time and space in affecting real social change and social transformation for all peoples, but specifically for women. And that being said, a couple of the papers very explicitly, I think, contextualized their considerations with an awareness of the longue durée of struggles for women's emancipation and gender equality. And so said sort of, how is it that in spite of 45, 50 years of considerable institutional, social, legal efforts and energy against gender-based violence and against gender-based forms of discrimination, have we nonetheless arrived at a moment where we see their persistence for so many women? And so that's sort of how I contextualize these 4 interdisciplinary papers. 3 of them, I think, were sort of considerations of efforts from above to empower women, or sometimes to presumably empower women. So we had a paper on political representation in post-colonial Uganda, which very helpfully contextualized a pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial gender dynamics and gender relations, and how the colonial project fundamentally transformed gender relations in Uganda, and looked at this paradox of how is it that there is a large representation of women in the government in Uganda, and yet fundamentally we have not seen women's empowerment. So secondly, we had another kind of consideration of efforts from above, this time the implementation of family planning programs in Ghana, and also attention to women's agency in the implementation of those family planning projects. So how are large-scale family planning projects experienced at the scale of the woman's bodies? So what kinds of resistances, what kind of narratives, and sometimes what kind of myths do people have in response to family planning in Ghana? And then a third paper was looking at international legal mechanisms, in this case the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and legal anti-discriminatory mechanisms, and why is it that, again, grappling with this issue of how is there such institutional or supposed institutional weight behind ending forms of gender discrimination, and yet they're falling flat based on maybe geopolitical relations and also cultural dismissals of these are Western-driven projects, right? So how do we respond to those critiques? And then the final paper was looking at grassroots and community saving and budgeting collectives in South Africa. And so this was looking at the ways in which people who have been external to financial mechanisms and banking have nonetheless found ways to come together collectively to save and to respond to those exclusions, to those financial exclusions. And so I think that the papers taken together very much reveal the ways in which women's rights and gender equality is a place of friction, ambiguity, paradox, right? So it's both the kind of grassroots efforts for gender emancipation, but also the ways in which those narratives can be appropriated by institutional or political elites. So this then, I think, leaves us with issues of what empowerment looks like, the scale and the temporality of of empowerment? How does social change and transformation occur? And so I think, again, looking at the importance of people's agency and how can even well-intentioned large-scale projects nonetheless stifle or appropriate agency at the grassroots or the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Dr. Farad?
Okay. It has been a true pleasure co-chairing this track 1, governance challenges and their impact on poverty and social challenges. We had rather a very large track, really. Today, the second day, we have had, in the first session, we had 3 papers, and in the second session, we had 4 papers. In a nutshell, the social protection seem to have taken over both of the sessions. But then we have had quite a few of other topics, including social protection. We had governance and economic growth. We had a topic like poverty reduction and governance again. We have had inclusive growth, welfare services, as I said, social protection again. Having co-chaired these sessions, I think most of the papers are really quite very interesting in a way that it had provided perspectives and made intellectual contribution to knowledge in these areas from various countries. We had papers also made comparative perspectives from 2 different countries. Some of the paper had a macro focus, was rich in a kind of thematic analysis. So I would go through one by one. As we have 7 papers, bear with me for a while. Like if I speak about 1 minute, it will get 7 minutes. I'm not yes. So if you don't summarize, the first paper was on social protection for informal sector in Zimbabwe. As you know, in Zimbabwe, we have like 6 million people are benefiting from social protection, where 90% of the economy is connected to social protection. So we had a very, very good paper on that. And then we had governance and economic growth in oil-producing CEMAC zone countries. The paper make very good economic analysis. And then use data from various sources, which looked very credible and very good analysis. We had social protection system to improve children's education in Tanzania. The paper was really good. We have had a lot of discussion about how the social protection program helped school children to enroll or re-enroll to the programs, and then it had made a lot of positive findings. The good thing I like it, like in research world, we are always critical. We always try to critique things, but this paper seemed to have acknowledged some achievements that this program really achieved. Then we had governance and poverty reduction policies in Nigeria, looked from a macro and historical perspective from 72 to 2018, and it looks really, really good. It also provided opportunities to look back and reflect what progress the government of Nigeria and other agencies, the stakeholders, they made. We had another paper on inclusive growth in the COMESA countries. The paper also presented rich set of data and had some analysis. We had the third paper in the second session, governance and welfare service delivery in Nigeria and South Africa. The best thing was that to look at both countries and a comparative perspective, there are quite many factors are very common, but then there are quite many factors in these two countries are quite not the same. It also generated some good discussion. The last paper was more action-oriented, enhancing the effects of social protection, cash transfers programs, with behavioral service. That was really very interesting to look at from a behavioral science perspective, how cash transfers program can be more efficient and effectiveness. The paper looked at 3 different countries, the similar programs, national safety net programs from Kenya, and similar programs from Tanzania and Madagascar. And the best thing was that, because as I said, it's an action-oriented paper, they seem to have developed tools to help the borrowers, and they seem to have also good control data that they developed some tools to help the borrowers so that these cash transfer programs can be enhanced. So all in all the papers are really, really good, and we really enjoyed our sessions. As you can see that we had 7 papers in one day and another 7 last day, so it was a wonderful opportunity to co-chair this session. Thank you.
Last but not least, Dr. Han Yerry, can you give us the brief?
Thank you for everyone, and thank you for the organizers. I'd like to start by thanking all of the participants. We came to an agreement that we would first of all request from the conference to write a strongly worded letter to our government to ask why people were denied visas. I think some people were, I feel quite strongly that we owe it. We can't be putting ourselves in this position of having a conference on Africa when we have put some people through a very difficult time, and I don't think that it's acceptable if the powers that be do not write in writing say why these visas were denied, so that also we know if it's a problem from our part, whether we were late or there's some sort of logistical communication problem. And I put this to the floor as something that I think we as Africans should transcend the propaganda of saying that we all love one another and maybe we don't. Today we had 6 papers. I'm very happy with the way that the track has incorporated West Africa, less so East Africa, Francophone Africa, and Anglophone Africa. And I think that thanks goes to my co-organizer, Professor Georgie Tsaka, who cannot be with us for family reasons, and unfortunately the person who was going to replace her, Dr. Michael Kipasa, also could not apply for a visa in time. And so I'm going to talk about the takeaways, not the papers. I think the takeaways really speak to a piece that appears in the Washington Post this morning about a huge redistribution RCT that has been conducted in Kenya, in Siaya province, where over the past 5 years, about $5 million have been distributed in the form of a $1,000 grant per family. And the RCT is looking at the effect of giving this money away. And I start my comments by saying that the politics of redistribution in Africa are at the heart of Africa's development path and at the heart of Africa's location within a global or international architecture or aid architecture. So this redistribution is here to stay, and owning, claiming, critiquing, understanding these relatively new politics of redistribution are essential. And I think there are 4 issues that came out from the papers. This morning's paper, we had papers from Benin, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. That's Francophone Africa. And I would really like to thank Dr. Adama, who acted as a volunteer translator because we actually had to run the panel in French. So thank you very much for that. So one was, for example, talking about failures in education that are leading to informal, quote-unquote, informal apprenticeship programs that are now absorbing more children than the school system. And looking at social or redistribution from that position of informality. That recurred in a Kenya paper on political patronage and cash transfers. So looking at how tools that are meant to be developmental, institutional, of formal tools are actually symptoms of failure and that are mimicking the informality that they are supposed to replace. We had another paper on corruption, and yesterday we had one by Dr. Adamasu on corruption, again from Nigeria. No, nothing intended, but I think these two papers on Nigeria on what to do about endemic corruption other than the westernized, very quote-unquote white notion of eradicating it. So corruption as a redistribution mechanism, corruption as something that can, the plea to have at least looters reinvest their loot domestically rather than put it in investment funds, as we have seen with Goldman Sachs and so on. So these are exciting papers. I mean, it's exciting to say, well, we're taking you to task because even our loot is being, other than the looting of commodities and so on, there is the looting of loot. And that is creating, impoverishing people. We also had another takeaway, which is about why do we talk about poverty alleviation in a very uncritical note, when poverty alleviation is another way of talking about redistributing levels of immiseration. And that less is said about creating wealth or lifting poverty. It's not lifting poverty, it's enabling people, empowering people. And I think that's another really interesting and important point to take out from this track, is that the language, the normalized, the technocratic language of poverty alleviation as a set of technologies or as a set of programs is honestly just not good enough because it lacks context, it lacks a sense of path dependency, it lacks a sense of region, and it lacks a sense of promise. And finally, I think what was most exciting also about the track is that it looked at redistribution from a cultural point of view, not just from an economistic point of view, but also to look at the cultural implications, the cultural meanings of different forms of redistribution, whether it's to create political patronage, whether it's to enable new forms of governance, whether it's a feature of an international global architecture of aid and aid dependence that is changing, and to really try to understand the location of Africa in this ever-changing architecture. So thank you for everyone, and I look forward to staying in touch, and thank you to AUC for organizing the conference.
Now, after we have got like the highlights of the presented papers and the different from different tracks, I do think of this sort of like getting together as an opportunity, and I want to seize this opportunity. We can go like business as usual, wait for 2 years. This is a biannual conference. We pick the next SDG, and we just like start calling for papers and all the rest of it. And we can do something very different if you tell me so. I mean, I'm the chairman of the organizing committee, and I'm going to organize the next one, hopefully, if I'm still around. So, but I mean, I would probably do what you suggest, or at least listen to your suggestions and take it back to the University Research Board and present it to them to give me guidance and clearance to go in the different directions. Would you want to guide us at AUC or guide me to take different routes, do something different until we meet again in 2 years' time. I'm open for all kinds of ideas. By the way, if you have also a question for the panelists, you can also do so, because there was a question back there, and do you have you can take this one. You can. Thank you. Take another one. But please, I mean, two things we need to think about, other than the question back there. One of them is what opportunities for integration we might have, and how to capture this and maybe take some action on it. The other thing is, how do you want to see this conference evolving? I mean, same, business as usual, or should we be thinking of something different, right? So I'll be happy to listen to your ideas and thoughts about that. We will take the question in the back there, and yes, go ahead, please.
I have a question directed to Dr. Amber. Do the efforts to end gender discrimination, should they only focus on power from above, or can the youth also play a role in ending gender discrimination, and how can they play a role?
That's to you. Yes.
Thank you very much for the question and for the energy behind the question as well. And I think that the only answer to that question can be absolutely, essentially, fundamentally, the youth have a tremendously important role to play in all sorts of actions around ending gender discrimination, gender equality, and that part of the conversation, I think especially the Q&A in our session, was talking about sort of the need for communication across different scales. And that there is no easy solution or model for what that will look like, that it needs to be context specific, but certainly that I think the papers this morning were showing that the kind of notion that there is a top-down model that can be superimposed into different regions or different communities is fundamentally flawed, and that's part of why we are here now. And so the youth, yes, absolutely creating spaces for youth to feel empowered and protected, to articulate what gender empowerment looks like. And yeah, in our session, we were also privileged to have quite a few students present for the conversation. Thank you.
Great. So we had enough time to think outside the box and come up with ideas. Can I listen to some ideas, please? Microphone here.
Professor Akombo Brown Lamadasun, Federal University, Wukari, Nigeria. On how we can actually keep the tempo running till the next conference. I honestly, like as I said yesterday, we cannot depend on conventional means of linking the gown with the town. The fact that probably the developed world are running on conventional means does not mean we should also run on conventional means, because I think Africa has a peculiar problem. And so we must drive it from the angle of the peculiarity. So having said that, my thinking here is that one, we must maintain a data of all those that have been involved in this conference. With that data, on quarterly basis, we could communicate. And one way to keep the tempo running is for us to look at the next 24 months and have an action point. And what I mean by this is that each of the track should become an action point. And so on monthly basis, or probably by monthly or quarterly basis, we could come up with a subject or a topic that is very, very relevant to the development of the African continent, and pose it as a kind of questions and allow members to react online. And of course, it could now become a group which we can now come up with a policy statement and probably circulate it to some of these bodies that are sub-regional or authorities that have to do with such issues. And I think if it is directed to the CEOs, it might become a point for them to look at and actions might begin to flow. So my thinking is that we should begin from that angle. Each of the track should become an action point throughout the 24 months till the next conference. And so we should maintain a data from which we can now always, a kind of network from which we can now always talk to ourselves.
Yes.
Secondly, I don't know. I think African values is beginning to decline as much as possible. And sorry, with all due respect to the women in this gathering. I think it is largely a product, too, of the way we define gender. The way we define gender. And I also want to think that I don't believe in gender equality. But I think that we should begin to look at it from our own conceptual perspective, not the Western perspective, which talk of gender equality. But we should begin to craft it in terms of gender equity. I think there's a huge difference between gender equity and gender equality. Gender equity has debased our family values. It has brought us down. Don't forget that gender is in context. There are matrilineal societies in Africa, and there are also patrilineal societies in Africa. And of course, they relate in various contexts. And of course, the question again, do not forget that there's a surge in the working class of women. And so that has tilted the balance between men and women and who is responsible. There are also decision points in African societies. Who takes the decision? So a lot of issue crops up. And this balance is what is creating a lot of devices we are seeing. A lot of devices and a lot of the ability of the family to hold on to values that will see us into serious development. I want to stop at that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, ideas? For gender equity, we take one question here, one there, one here. Okay? Okay.
But it is a general comment. Sure. Just based off of some conversations I've been having with other conference participants, and it's more around the issue of logistics. So, as scholars, when we come to conferences, we do a lot of the labor around the intellectual ideas. Sure. And so when we show up, I think a lot of us, especially traveling internationally, like to know that things are already taken care of and that things are communicated clearly, effectively, and in a timely manner. I can speak for myself and some of the people I've been communing with that hasn't really been the case here. So for example, I haven't had internet access the entire time, even though I've asked repeatedly. People haven't communicated panels changing. Just different logistical things that make it hard to fully enjoy the conference, especially traveling internationally, as all of us have been doing. So I think in the next conference, to really kind of put yourselves in the position of those of us who are traveling to do this work, and maybe thinking through the kind of details and attention to things that we might need in order to bring our best selves and our best intellectual work.
Thank you very much. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I would just like
please.
to second this. I have not been traveling, or I didn't come to the conference from abroad. I'm from the area, and but I'm still surprised, and it comes from a place of love. Like it comes from a place of us caring about AUC, and so please receive the comment as such. It's well intended, but. In terms of communication and logistics, we would hope that the next conference would live up to that.
Okay, but the only thing that I can do is to apologize for any organizational issues that have taken place. We definitely always will look for improving. This is our first conference. Your feedback is very important and will definitely be considered in our next conference, logistics, if we'll have one. Thank you very much. And we'll be back to you if you have any intellectual points that you want to contribute with. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Mine is, I'm not very sure if it makes sense. But you see, the challenge that we have as a continent is something that has been highlighted in most of the presentations that have been made. It's mostly to do with implementation. In terms of policy making, everything on paper is good, but it's the implementation that is lacking. So I wanted to suggest, I understand these conferences are more academic, something to do with research and all the stuff. And most of the people who come here, they have an intention of publishing their researches. But at the same time, I think we can make them more practical, especially if you invite particularly policymakers. For example, we're talking about corruption in Nigeria. If we could have someone, a decision maker from Nigeria, like having an interactive session with such kind of people, it becomes a little bit more practical. Because, we've been writing our researches for a long time. The people who are intended for such researches, they never look at them. And those are the policymakers from the different countries where we come from. Thank you. I don't know if it makes sense.
It does. But, it does. From my own point of view, it does. Trying to approach more interaction between academicians and practitioners in the field, whether in the civil society, in the development field, and in the government operation, I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Yes, and we definitely can try to achieve that. Any other points? Sure. Okay. Wait, there's one mic over there. Okay.
If you don't mind. I just want to use this opportunity because I see some of you coming from all parts of Africa. And maybe you have not heard of the Africa Academy of Management. But I want to take the opportunity to inform you of it. This is a scholarly community that was created by Africans for Africans, particularly those in the business field. And its main focus is the advancement and promotion of management of business scholarship in Africa. So I would encourage you, you can Google it, you can find the information. We move around Africa every 2 years. This year, for instance, we are going to be in Nigeria, Lagos Business School for our 6th biennial conference. But we also have what we call faculty development workshops that we alternate. And this particular year, we were in AUC here in June. Our next one would be in 2021. We don't know where that will be yet, but if you look out for that information, you would find it. I mentioned that because when he was talking, he talked about publishing your papers. And the Africa Academy of Management has a journal, the premier journal of management in Africa, which is the Africa Journal of Management. It is set up such that it would compete with the top management journals in other places. That is our objective. And if you want to publish your work, that would be an avenue for you. It's high quality, high impact, and I would encourage you not only to take the word from here, but to share it as you go back to your various schools about the Africa Academy of Management and the Africa Journal of Management. Thank you very much.
I have a suggestion for the organizers, and that was a suggestion originally made when planning the conference, that this conference would really benefit if it had institutional partners. So the idea of doing a conference on Africa, open call, maybe is, it would be a good thing to reflect on it, that there are other academic partners, implementers, NGOs, civil society, amazing universities, certainly who have more of a presence in Africa, in the rest of Africa, than we do, and that it would really strengthen this conference to make it a Pan-African conference rather than an AUC conference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the conference, it was a good conference, but there are a number of logistical problems that I would want to highlight, as well as good takeaway points. Now, the first thing is what I noticed, there are quite a number of guys who are working on their PhDs on issues related to SDG goals, like the first one, no poverty. I know there are financial challenges, but it could have been a good idea in future. We have a pre-conference session whereby, there's some bit of education on how emerging scholars communicate to the world, how they could present. Because for me, from where I come from, most of the PowerPoints that I saw there are not PowerPoints at all. It was just a lump of piece of work that was slotted, but they were not PowerPoints. So as we go, we need to progress on that aspect. And then also in terms of logistics, it would be a good idea, when you are coming here, to just have a general insight of, I know you can't cater for individual needs, but you can do that to a certain extent. I was particularly worried by the level of discrimination that took place during the conference. There were some people who were living at the hotel. Unfortunately, I was one of those people who were living at the dormitory. And to be honest with you, the place wasn't that good. I mean, for me, and I'm also speaking particularly for those people who were living in the dormitories. I'm not used to the idea that I wake up in the morning and then there's no breakfast. For the last 2 days, I never ate breakfast, and I think it's something that could be improved. In future, you can indicate to people what they eat and what they don't eat. That is very important, because the moment I feel that I'm well catered for, it is very easy for me to give it my all to the conference. So I think if you do that, this will be a very successful conference. But however, having said all this, thank you for the opportunity, and I think emerging scholars like myself will benefit in future. Tatenda, thank you.
One thing is maybe you can build, thank you for all the critiques and everything, but the amount of effort put from the AUC team internally was much above all. It's been a year in planning and there's been a lot of work behind that. So I just want to thank everyone who worked throughout this, and Dr. Idris again for your leadership throughout the whole year planning. But maybe to address a lot of issues that have been raised, maybe we should not rely only on AUC faculty and team and administration, and you should try to recruit today whoever's going to be working from you, you're the chair of a committee, and the committee has always been, to my understanding, members of AUC faculty. So, we're here, and if you can commit to coming in 2 years, please step up to the, members of the committee and represent, and then you can actually rely on you in attracting your crowd, your group, your discipline. The SDG coming up is focused more than the poverty. It's on food, agriculture. So we can have more technology tracks and more business tracks, and we can even structure it differently. But these ideas need to be ahead of time, planned, and with multiple lenses. It's very easy to critique in retrospect, but definitely we can build on the future now that we know what we're doing and we know our capabilities and our limitations in terms of accommodations or hotel capacities, I'm sure, our busing capacities. We have all this knowledge behind us, and we can definitely do another excellent round. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea, because we have the time, so we can really start doing planning, and it's very important to find partners coming up to play some role and to participate into that. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for putting this conference together. I just wanted to speak on, in terms of this conference being an interdisciplinary conference happening at AUC. Now, I understand that we need to branch out and bring others, and that's very important. But I was hoping that we would have more representation from AUC faculty, here, because that would become perhaps a sign of cohesiveness in terms of this understanding of a placement in Africa. I am a faculty member here in the School of Education. So, to me, that was one of the things I was looking forward to see how much do we have represented here as fellow Africans and in collaboration with other, people? But it seemed like it was very, very, very little. I understand when you have a conference and it's on a specific discipline, you won't have a lot of representation from that particular university. But this is an interdisciplinary conference, and it's on Africa, Africa's challenges. And I think mathematics, physics, anything should have been here. So maybe some more work needs to be, we need to do a lot of work. I understand this is a big challenge here because it's also a change of mindset of, understanding our own placement and identity and so on and so on. So, and I commend that you've, put this phenomenal work around this, Egypt and Africa and AUC, and so on and so on. But it's work in progress. Just maybe a way to also explain to the people here who might be wondering where are the AUC faculty members. But yeah, it's work in progress. Thank you.
Can I return that question back to you? I mean, you are an AUC faculty, right? And you go to different conferences and different events happening on campus based on interest, I guess. Yes. What triggers you to go to one of these if it's totally outside your area? Because we can use this and start to promote and start to reach out to people.
Yeah, exactly the idea of interdisciplinarity. That's why I emphasize that, because this is not a conference on education. It's not a conference on, when I go to comparative and international education conferences, I don't see a lot of faculty represented because that's not their field of interest. If it's a mathematics conference, it's different. But the emphasis that's been placed on this conference has been interdisciplinarity. And so to me, that's what we need to, that's part of what we're going to be trying to pass the message to the rest of the faculty. And it's a liberal arts institution, which is another component of it. So a person in physics coming to this conference would have learned something, contributed something. A person in business, the same thing. So any discipline would have found a home here. And the central locus is really Africa. And so we are working on the African continent to deal with African challenges. So that's, to me, that's the message that should, be, Thank you.
Thank you. It's very valid. There's one comment here.
Again, as I've said already, thank you very much for the conference. It has been good in spite of the challenges that we have met. But my question is that we have attended so many conferences about Africa's challenge. The question is, what next? Because we already know we have so many challenges, but what are we going to do about those challenges? So that we don't just end this conference and go home, wait for another conference. What next? What are we going to do to ensure that this becomes life for people who face these challenges on a daily basis? Two, is that when we look at Agenda 2063 of the African Union, they are considering some of the issues that we have been talking about here. How about maybe next time trying to ensure that at least some representation from the AU will be with us? And equally, to share some of what we have talked about here with them. And lastly, is that what is going to happen to all the ideas that we have shared here? Are we going to have a publication? How will it look like? We have published a lot. But can it be, I think we have to come up with something that is unique and attractive to the African audience.
You're exactly actually addressing the question for which we have set this session, is there are takeaways from different tracks. Those have been presented to the floor, to everyone, and the expectations was to come back. I mean, of course, next conference, you're going to try to fix everything and so on, logistics and the like. But the expectations was, well, what kind of critical integrations we can do and turn it into a joint research project between different disciplines, different universities, and we start working on activating those or trying to find funding or even squeeze some internal funding and get it started and so on. This is the kind of thing that I was hoping for, that I was expecting. Something that came, that's standing out from education, that links itself very well into governance and really ties into a business model, for instance. So this combination worth further investigation, like streamlining the model, make a pilot, and things like that. So I was really, really hoping for the discussion and the dialogue to produce. Right? I mean, it's very important that we share ideas, but it's important that we find ways to integrate ideas and turn them into actionable projects or programs or ideas of this kind. So this is the kind of thing that was sort of like I was filled with hope that we're going to get some of these. Sure. Mike, can you please? Yes, ma'am. Mike.
Sorry, there was something that really escaped me. I honestly think that we could have also a beginning where we have working groups. Could be working groups on governance, could be working group on gender, working groups on conflicts, so that you can decide which of the groups you belong into, where you have serious interest. And that could become a very serious point from which we can develop relationships and research. But certainly a lot of us have our own area of specialization, or area of interest in terms of research. And if we have up to about 10, 15 working groups, some on poverty and so on and so forth, and people begin to queue into this area, and even if you are not attending this conference or you are attending the other conference, and you have wind of it and you are desirous of belonging to it, as long as you're in academia or you are in research, then we will have a very large group or point from which to actually develop serious academia, and from which also we can also communicate policy makers. And like as I said again, when we have such working groups, communication of policies to those who implement these policies become easy, because we can then have a focus. And like as I said, we do not have to communicate policies from an evolutionary point of view. And I think we have to pursue it from a revolutionary point of view, not the conservative methods we used to know. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are sort of like running out of time. I would have just to share with you the thank you note from the provost, who was not able to make it to this conference for several reasons and other commitments. It's just what I'd like to thank you all for guests and speakers who contributed to the success of this conference, as well as the many AUC offices and staff who worked behind the scenes to make it happen. And of course, a huge thank to the faculty across campus who worked tirelessly to support the conference in any way that they could. He wanted to congratulate you for the success of the conference. We still consider getting together, presenting the kind of academic contributions, getting the start of the dialogue and the start of discussion, and even trying to figure out the ability of getting a continuation out of that. I think it's a reasonable success to congratulate people for, and to look forward to seeing you all and your colleagues in ICRAC 2021. Thank you very much.